Well, good afternoon, everybody. Just thanks for coming to our workshops. We are excited to be able to do this. The other advantage is that if you want to watch this later, or you have friends you want to share it with, you can tell them about it. They'll be able to access it on our YouTube channel, which they can get to from our website. So, if something goes wrong or you have to leave early, you can watch the rest of it later. So today we're going to be talking about planting early spring crops. And I know there's a lot of pent up, garden energy that people have been just, last year was such a difficult year with the pandemic, and we're still obviously in a pandemic. But right now, it's time to start thinking about gardening, and people will be able to plant some stuff pretty soon here. So we're going to talk about that today. First, we'll be talking about in general early spring crops, and then the last part of the workshop, we'll be talking about specific crops and how to grow them and what things apply to them specifically. So as far as characteristics of early spring crops, here's what makes a, a spring crop by definition, the early stuff. So there are obviously crops that grow better in cooler weather. In fact, often they don't do well in warm weather. In warm weather, the quality, the flavor, the taste will deteriorate. For instance, broccoli, we cannot grow broccoli here all summer long. It just gets too hot. Same thing with lettuce. So these are things that crops that definitely grow better in the cooler weather, and that's why they are good crops for this time of year. The other thing about the early spring crops is typically they can take a light frost. Lots of people get worried when they hear that, it's going to be down to 32 or even 30, or it's just going to be cold and rainy, and they're worried about their little plants they may put out. These crops we're talking about today can take that. They can take those lower temperatures, and we'll talk more specifically about what that means. The other thing is usually they're faster growing crops, meaning they're going to produce in a short season, usually about 30 to 70 days, depending on the crop. Something like tomato plants, obviously, they'll go all season long for several months. That's a warm season crop. But the spring crops, obviously, they need to finish before it starts getting too hot. So that's what makes these crops all early spring crop categories. So one of the biggest questions I get, and one of the biggest things gardeners struggle with, is knowing when to plant, because the weather just gets crazy. We had all this really, really warm weather a few weeks ago, and before that it was extremely cold. But a lot of people were wondering during that warm period, should they be planting? And it's still kind of early. And so how do you know when it is? And so some people actually just wait till it feels like you get a warm day and they go out and want to plant because it feels warm and sunny. But that is not the right answer. Other people go to the Farmer's Almanac. They think that somehow it has the great source of information, all the answers, and I will tell them that I don't think is a good source of information, specifically because it's trying to deal with the whole country and regions, and they aren't tuned into the specific things that are happening right here in our area. The other thing, sometimes people say, well, like, what zone are we in? Were we zone 5 or zone 6? That really has more to do with plant hardiness for like trees and shrubs. And then sometimes people will pick up a seed packet from someplace like Home Depot or a nursery, and it'll just have information on the back, and it'll tell you like plant after the last frost or the average last frost. But that can change from year to year, and that's also, again, you don't know when that is because it's talking kind of generically. So really, the best answer is to plant by the planting calendar, and do it also. You want to check the 10-day forecast to see what's coming up. So we'll talk about this here in just a minute about that planting calendar. But let's just a little bit about definitions of frosts and freezes, what they actually mean, because there's different levels. So you hear the term frost, what that refers to specifically is, the formation of ice crystals on plants and also ground surfaces. And it typically happens at 32 degrees. Can happen if it's a little warmer. Sometimes the air temperature will be a little warmer, but the ground temperature is a little cooler. It has to do with, water vapor condensing on surfaces and all that kind of good stuff. So frost is actually kind of complicated. There's lots of different factors. So really a better way to think about it is light freeze, moderate freeze, and severe freeze. So obviously water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So a light freeze as far as plants are concerned is in the 29 to 32 degree range. And what that means in that range, tender plants, ones that aren't cold hardy, aren't early spring crops, are going to be killed. So things like if you had a tomato plant out, when it hits 30 degrees, it's going to die. A pepper plant, it's going to die. Other things though, like broccoli, cabbage, kale, they can take those light freezes and it's not too big of a problem. Okay, then there's a moderate freeze, which is 25 degrees to 28 degrees. It's a little colder. And that will damage most plants because that's pretty cold. But specifically things like fruit blossoms and of course any tender plants will be damaged severely. But again, the hardier plants, think of things like kale, chives, collard greens, spinach. Those can all take this moderate freeze. They may have a little bit of leaf damage, but they will survive. And if you have them under row cover, which we'll talk about later, they'll do even better. And then there's the severe freeze, which is like 24 degrees and colder. So that's quite a bit colder. That's 8 degrees below freezing. And so that will pretty much damage most plants other than like hardy trees and shrubs and hardy perennials. If things have leaves on them, it will affect the leaves. So this is true for both spring and fall. So those are kind of the 3 levels of freezes that happen around here. So when they say it's going to freeze tonight, it kind of depends on how cold is it actually going to get. And here's a chart that shows the average last freeze dates for Kansas City. And again, it's talking about light freeze, moderate freeze, hard freeze. And so you see some percentages up here. That's the percentage of actually the chance of getting it. So, you know, for April 21st, the chance of getting a light freeze is only 10%. That's pretty low. But if you look at, say, March 29th, the chance is 80% that we're still going to have a light freeze. In fact, we had a light freeze just last night. So the later you get into the year, the less likely we are having a chance of a freeze. Even this chart can be a little complicated for trying to figure out when to plant. So really, the best way is using the garden planting calendar. And this planting calendar is available on our website. If you go to our website and click on resources, you'll see some plant information guide sheets, and you can print one of these yourself. We also have them here at our office. If you just want to pick up a paper copy sometime, just ask for one. This is really a useful sheet, and we use it all the time here, and I recommend it strongly that you have one of these. I even like to have one of these when I'm out in the garden. I'll fold it up and put it in my pocket, because if I'm trying to think about when I'm going to plant something, I'll just pull it out and I'll look at it. You know, every year is going to be a little bit different. I want you to be aware of the ideal planting windows for each crop. And so this calendar will tell you that. But you can sometimes, if you want to take some risks, you can plant outside the ideal planting windows. And sometimes, some years it works out. It just depends because every year is different. But here's this planting calendar in a little close up. So on this calendar, you'll see a whole bunch of different plants listed. For instance, beets, right up here in this left-hand corner. That's something that you'd be planting from seeds. It's not talking about plants. Like right below it, you'll see broccoli, and in parentheses, it mentions plants. So what that tells you is that whenever you're planting beets, you're going to be planting it from seed because it doesn't mention plants. Whenever you're going to be planting broccoli, you're always going to be planting plants because planting seeds doesn't work very well around here. But as far as the dates, some of these will have just one date range. Some of them will have 2, like beets. You'll see it has 2. The first one is from March 15th to April 15th. So that's the planting window. The ideal planting window for beets is March 15th to April 15th. So if you can get them in early in there, you'll get beets earlier. If you wait too late, your beets may not do very well because it'll start to get too hot. But then you'll see right under that, there's a second planting date. And that is for, I'm trying to get my mouse to focus on here. For planting for fall gardens, you'll see a date here of August 1st to August 10th. That's actually in late summer, and that's when you would plant beet seeds for a fall garden. Same thing true for the broccoli. It's March 20th to April 10th is the planting date for broccoli plants, and then planting again July 25th to August 5th. So every one of these crops has an ideal planting window, and I strongly recommend you try to plant inside that window. You're much more likely to have success. The other factor that really plays into the planting, when to plant, is the 10-day forecast. And right now it's great time to be a gardener because you can check your forecast on your phone so easily. This is just a screenshot from weather.com. It shows you the 10-day forecast, like what's happening today. It also shows you what's happening the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day. Oops. You can look at this, and not only will it tell you temperatures, but also will tell you if there's chances for rain, which is really helpful. Because if you're going to maybe plant on Saturday and it looks like it's going to rain on Saturday, then you might want to try to plant on Friday evening. But also it will tell you about temperatures. So, you know, the 10-day forecast is not always perfectly accurate, but it gives you a general sense of what direction the temperatures are heading. Are we heading into a warm spell or a cold spell? The other thing just to keep in mind is it can change rapidly. So just don't assume that just because it tells you 5 days from now it's going to be warm, that when we actually get there, it's going to be warm, because 5 days from now it could change. So they change this every day, and you can look at it on your phone or on the computer. So like looking right here, this was from last year I did this. It's talking about a Friday, and this is not for this year, but on Friday night, they were talking about it going down to 27 degrees at night. So that would be the low. So that's a moderate freeze. So that would mean you probably would not want to put out, you know, your little baby plants unless you were going to cover them up with row cover. So, but these other temperatures that are like in the 40s and the 30s, even though it's 35 degrees, that's cold, but that's not too cold for all these cool season plants. So right now, our 10-day forecast is looking pretty good. But here's what happened a few years ago, because obviously every season is different. Back in 2007, on April 7th, we had like the worst freeze that I remember, and probably anyone remembers, in a long time. On April 7th, which is pretty late, it was 18 degrees, which is a very hard freeze. And then in 2013, we had a 6-inch snow on March 23rd, but also in 2013, we had a 2-inch snow on May 2nd, which was crazy. So every year is different. They were talking about snow a couple nights ago, but it didn't happen. And so I'm glad it didn't happen, but there's still a chance we could get some snow here. And snow is not necessarily a kiss of death for some cool season plants like kale or collards or spinach. They can take a little snow, they'll be fine. It really has to do more with the air temperatures that are coming. So temperatures will go up and down. No 2 years will be the same. And sometimes even if you're planting by the planting calendar and you're using the correct dates, you may still need to protect if the weather changes and gets colder than what they were expecting. So here's what happened on that April 7th, 2007, when it went to 18 degrees. It actually killed blossoms on fruit trees. Of course, peach trees and cherry trees, all those, that's pretty normal for them to die. But what happened that year was it actually froze the blossoms on apple trees. And I remember my teacher in college, our fruit professor, telling us that that happens only about once every 100 years. And so hopefully it's not going to happen again for a long time. So there are some ways to protect plants. You can protect plants. Sometimes people think the easiest way to do it is to make a little greenhouse. Get some cheap plastic polyethylene sheeting, make a structure and stick your plants in there. And you can do that. The problem is it overheats so fast. Inside that plastic on a sunny day like today, it will get to 100 degrees easily. And that's way too hot. So you need to vent that. And so that means you have to roll up the sides. You have to open it up. every time the sun comes out. So that's kind of a lot of work. If you miss that, you easily could cook your plants. The other thing is then you have to close it at night. And if you don't do that, that means your plants could freeze. So it's kind of complicated. I do not recommend this type of protection for your plants just because it's too difficult to manage. I mean, if you had a greenhouse and you had heaters and fans and things like that, that's a little bit different. What works much better is a product called Row Cover. And if you haven't seen this, it's a fabric. We actually sell it here at our office. They sell it at garden centers. You can buy it on the internet. It's a very lightweight fabric. What's interesting about it is it's porous, and so it lets water through, but it also lets sunlight through. But it does provide some warmer growing temperatures. It retains the heat, but it doesn't overheat. So you can get plants going earlier in the spring, and you can also keep them going later in the fall. And it'll have different brand names. The one you hear a lot sometimes is called Reme or Agribon, but most places right now aren't even calling it by brand names. They're just calling it Row Cover. And it comes in different widths. Anyhow, it'll provide protection from freezing temperatures. Like, obviously, if it gets too cold, it's not going to protect. And there's different weights of it. Like there's a lightweight, there's a medium weight, and a heavy weight that have different levels of cold protection. We have a middle medium weight at our office that we use, and it gives you about 4 degrees, which makes a big difference. If you have little plants out and it goes down to 28 degrees and you can cover it up with row cover, you should be fine. So we've had even 26 and 24. It will protect plants pretty well. It's also pretty low cost. It's reusable. When you're done with it in spring, just roll it up, put it in your garage, and then save it for fall later. The other thing is it also will keep insects out because it acts like a screen. This is like a little tent right here. And for plants like cabbage and broccoli, you're trying to keep out those pesky white butterflies that lay the eggs that cause cabbage worms. It will help keep them out. So it really is kind of useful for that too. It's also so much lower maintenance than the plastic covers because you don't have to open them up when the sun is shining. It's not going to get too hot in there, and you just leave them covered up until you're ready to start harvesting, or if you need to get in there to do a little weeding, you can lift the side up. But you don't have to open and close them every day. And there's different ways to do it. Sometimes people will put up a little plastic hoop house like that using PVC pipe or metal pipe. You can also make a wooden frame like that. You can make frames out of anything you want. They come in different widths. The width that we have is about 6 feet, but you can buy extra wide widths like they use on farms if you really want something big. And so it just is really useful. And then you can just tuck it in at the bottom and help keep out that cold. All right, so that's row cover. So getting ready for planting, getting the soil ready. One of the questions is get your soil in condition to till. And there are some people right now who are interested in doing no-till gardening. And I talk about that a little bit in my basic gardening class. The problem is lots of times initially your soil doesn't have very much organic matter. So I recommend, even if you are going to do no-till gardening, maybe till at least once. So you can add a lot of organic matter and mix it in with the soil. The other thing with no-till gardening is you have to really make sure you keep the weeds down. So you need to mulch and make sure you control weeds as they pop up because it's just hard to break the cycle of weeds. Ideally, you would have tilled your garden last fall. That helps bury insect eggs and get rid of plant residues. Some people like to mulch their garden over the winter. I tell them if you do that, you need to remove the mulch because otherwise that mulch is just going to hold moisture in and it's going to make the ground stay wet. If you're going to till, the ground actually needs to be fairly dry because if it's too wet, it'll just turn into mud balls and it'll pack that soil together and it'll ruin the soil structure. And this is especially true with clay because clay is so sticky. When you till and it's wet, it just makes that clay all stick together in little mud balls. And sometimes it'll take several years before that soil breaks up again and really gets to be in good condition. I actually had that happen to me once. So if it happens to you, you'll know that and you'll realize this was not a good idea. So if you get your tiller out and you're starting to till, and even if it's not clay, but it's making things kind of ball up and turn into mud balls, just stop tilling and wait. What I tell people is you can use hand tools like a spading fork or a broad fork and use that to open up the ground and loosen it. And then that helps it dry out quicker. And then if you need to, you can till it. If not, you can even just use a rake and get it ready that way. One of the things for early spring crops that can be very helpful is to have raised beds. And if you haven't seen these are structures. Usually they have some kind of a side, like something made out of wood or stone blocks or something. And raised beds are just a way to use a little bit of garden space and have it be separate from what you're walking on, because you have paths in between. So the idea with these raised beds is that you're not ever going to be walking on them. And so that will stop the soil from getting compacted. But these raised beds will also dry out earlier in the spring, and the soil will warm up faster. So you can plant sooner. If we're having lots and lots of rain, I'll actually tell people to put a sheet of plastic over their raised bed, and that will stop it from getting too wet. And then you can pull off the plastic when you're ready to plant. The soil will be nice and dry. But even if it does rain, your raised bed will dry out quicker. So usually within a day or so after the rain, you can go out and plant, and that will make it easier. Also, if you're trying to use row covers, it's easier to put them over the raised beds. The soil will be looser, easier to work by hand. So there's just lots of great advantages. If you also want to plant early, putting that plastic over will help warm the soil up earlier and make it, easier to plant earlier. So the other thing is you can actually just get more food per square foot in a raised bed than you can in a regular ground plot. So obviously there's some cost involved with building raised beds, but it can be worth it. I'm actually going to be teaching a separate workshop coming up later this spring on raised beds that will talk about building them and what types of materials and what kind of soil do you use and just how to use them. So watch for that if you're interested in raised beds. The other question I get sometimes, especially from beginning gardeners, is about planting seeds or planting plants. Which one is better and which one is appropriate? And it kind of depends on the crop. I've actually had some gardeners tell me they're going to start all their seeds indoors in the window early so they can plant them out later. And the problem is with that is planting in a window inside doesn't usually work very well because the lighting isn't very good. But also not everything transplants very well. So when you start from a plant, it's kind of easier. You get an earlier start, earlier harvest. For instance, if you're planting a broccoli plant, that plant's been growing for about 4 weeks. And so it has a head start, as opposed to if you just put a broccoli seed out in the ground, it will grow, but it may not produce a nice broccoli head by the time it starts getting hot. In fact, I can tell you right now, it probably wouldn't. Same thing with cabbage and lettuce, some of the lettuces, the head lettuces. Or even if you're planting a tomato seed, it's going to take a long time to get tomatoes, whereas if you plant a tomato plant, you will get tomatoes much earlier. So you'll get earlier start, earlier harvest. It's also easier for some gardeners, to plant a plant. Sometimes gardeners are a little, if you haven't done it before, it's a little scary to plant little tiny seeds and think, oh, if I'm planting a plant, it's much easier because it's easier to handle. They are more expensive, obviously, to plant plants as opposed to like planting seeds. So for instance, lettuce, you can plant seeds or you can plant plants. But if you go buy a whole bunch of lettuce plants, that could be expensive. But you can plant a whole bunch from seed, and it's very inexpensive. The other thing is not every plant is a good candidate for transplanting, for growing in the greenhouse. Like if you go to a greenhouse, you will not see bean plants for sale, or turnip plants, or carrot plants, or typically pea plants or corn, because they are not good transplants. They don't transplant very well. their root systems do not like to be transplanted. It's better to plant them directly in the ground. But other things like cabbage, broccoli, lettuce, those are all good candidates because they transplant very well. Of course, the seeds, obviously it's an inexpensive way to get lots of plants. You do need to thin them out properly. If you sprinkle out a whole bunch of seeds and they all come up, you need to do thinning. You know, sometimes the germination is uneven, but you do get a really strong root system when you're putting out seeds because they aren't hindered by the growing container. And if you're planting seeds, it's just going to take longer to get to harvest. If you're planting lettuce seeds, it'll take a while longer than it will if you put out a lettuce plant. So. Okay, so soil temperature has a big factor for germination when you put seeds out. The warmer it is, the quicker the seeds will germinate. So it's really that soil temperature that's going to be the factor. Even though maybe we're having a really warm day, it's been warm for a couple of weeks, lots of times that soil is still cold, especially if it hasn't been tilled, and especially if it's a ground plot. Raised beds do warm up quicker. But these are some temperatures. This is the minimum temperature. That soil has to be at least in the 40s here before most seeds even germinate. And even then they germinate slowly. So if you can warm your soil up, the seeds will sprout quicker. So that's why that's a handy garden trick to put a sheet of plastic over your raised bed because it'll warm that soil up quicker and it'll make those seeds germinate faster. So something to think about. The other thing with spring plants, the early spring crops, is because they like to grow in the cooler weather, when it starts to get warm, sometimes what happens is the plants start going to seed. And this is called bolting. You'll hear this term if you read gardening books or you're reading on the websites. It talks about, you know, lettuce is bolting, your spinach is bolting, your mustard and turnip greens are bolting. That means they're just going to seed. So lots of time gardeners will try to keep nursing them along, hoping they'll get better. If you look at this lettuce plant here, you can see it's changed the way it grows. Instead of growing a nice head of lettuce, it's turning into this giant thing that looks almost like a Christmas tree with some decorations on it. And those are the little flower buds getting ready to form because it's going to seed. So typically the quality is terrible. Once the lettuce starts to do this, it gets very bitter. And even other plants, they stop growing extra leaves, which is what you're trying to get, like from spinach or lettuce, and they just start producing these seed heads. So typically when a plant starts to bolt, just pull it out, rip it out, and then you're going to plant again later, maybe in the late summer for fall. You could plant some more lettuce or spinach or whatever. Or you could put something else in for summer. You could plant some green beans, some zucchini, some cucumbers, whatever works good with the planting calendar. If we have a long, cool spring, that can kind of make it late for planting tomatoes, but that can give us a really long, cool time for the vegetables. So you'll have a nice long period of growing lettuce. Or in the fall, if it happens, we have an extra long fall before it gets too cold. You can just really get a long season of enjoying all your vegetable crops. So that's not a bad thing. All right, we're going to talk about, excuse me, I need a little drink here. Some different crops. These are some of the more popular early season crops. I also forgot to mention there is another handout that's available on our website. It's called Cool Season Plants, Warm Season Plants, and it has a list of both. And it's really just helpful because you look on the left side of the sheet and it lists all the cool season plants. So you'll know all the ones that would be good for planting now, spring. So that's the ones we're going to be talking about right here. And we're going to go through these alphabetically. So this is arugula. And if you haven't had arugula, it's a wonderful spring green. It's in the mustard and cabbage family. When it gets old or it gets too hot, it gets kind of strong and kind of spicy tasting or sometimes a skunky taste. It grows pretty fast. You want to eat the leaves while it's young. This is something that you typically would not buy plants for. They wouldn't sell it, although you probably could try some plants from it if you could find them. But it's real easily just to seed it in the ground. So you want to plant it early, like March 15th to April 25th. What some people will do is plant a few at that first part of the date, like that March 15th date. So you could actually have planted that even a week ago or so. And then maybe plant a second crop more like the middle of April, because that will give you a longer season of production. And then, of course, again, you can plant it again in August for fall. This picture, if you notice, you'll notice some little tiny holes in the leaves, and that is from flea beetles, which is a very small insect that eats little tiny holes in certain plants. And we'll see some other crops that have problems with flea beetles. I am going to be teaching a workshop coming up here. I think it's in June on insect problems. And I strongly recommend that you watch that because it will just help you understand like which insects are going to be a main problem. There are so many different kinds of bugs, but really there's just a very few that bother certain crops. And it will help you just to become a more aware gardener and know more about what's going on and what to expect. So if you plant arugula, there's a good chance you're going to have some problems with flea beetles. And there's some relatively easy, safe, organic controls that you can use to help control that. All right, beets. Beets are kind of a multi-purpose vegetable because not only do they produce that wonderful red round beet, they also produce tops, the leaves, and if you wait till your beet is mostly grown, you can also harvest the leaves and eat them as a cooked green, just like you might cook spinach or Swiss chard or collard greens or something like that. So you can steam them, you can saute them. If you haven't had beet greens, I recommend them. They're really, really good. And you typically don't see them in the store, but they're very, very good, very tasty, and super nutritious. And I did talk about red beets, but there are also golden beets, which are kind of fun. They have a little bit different flavor, a little bit on the sweet side, sweeter side. Thing that confuses people sometimes is when they open up their seed packet, they see these kind of spiky looking little seeds, and that's actually not an individual seed. That's actually a seed capsule, which is actually the fruit of the beet plant. And inside that little capsule, there's like 3 or 4 seeds. So you want to space the beet seed capsules out about every 2 inches or so, at least 1 to 2 inches, so they have room to develop. And knowing that even though you're spacing them out, you're going to need to thin them because you'll plant that little seed capsule and 2 or 3 plants might all grow from the same place. And if they're too crowded, those beet roots will not have a chance to develop. So you definitely want to thin them out. The other thing that people do sometimes that's not good is they'll let their beets stay in the ground too long and the beets get big and they think, wow, I'm getting this really giant beet. But once they get too big, like past 3 inches or even 2.5 inches, the flavor and quality goes down. They get kind of woody, kind of stringy and chewy, and they're not really good quality. So if you want a small, fresh, young beet is the best for your different recipes and things like that. So planting dates for beets are going to be springtime, March 15th to April 15th, and then again in fall. So you'll be planting the first part of August. All right, broccoli. I love broccoli. It is one of my favorite vegetables. What's kind of fun to think about broccoli is like, what part of the plant are you eating? Because, you know, when you're eating, say, spinach, you know you're eating a leaf. When you're eating carrots, you know you're eating roots. When you're eating onions, you know you're eating a bulb. So there's different parts of the plants that we eat. When you're eating broccoli, it's a little bit different. What you're actually eating is a flower head, you know, flower buds that are in a tight head, and the flower buds have not opened up yet. In fact, if you let your broccoli go too long, it will actually have little tiny flowers on it. And of course, then the quality isn't very good. So you're supposed to pick your broccoli before it starts to flower. But all those little tiny buds in there are all flower buds that are waiting to open, and you're going to eat them before they open. So broccoli definitely works best if you plant it as a plant rather than trying seeds, just because we have a short, cool season here. You only have so much time to get your broccoli in and have it grow up to produce a head before it gets too hot. So When you do cut that broccoli head, you're going to cut it off close to the base. And then lots of times the broccoli will have little side shoots coming out. And each one of those little side shoots will have a little tiny broccoli head on it. So you'll get some secondary production even after you pick that first head. The thing is that broccoli is very sensitive to heat and just does not do well. Once temperatures get into the 80s and night temperatures are getting warm, broccoli does not grow very well and does not produce very well. So at that point, it's time to pull up the plants and then just wait till later. You're looking at this planting date here. So March 20th to April 10th is the time for planting plants in the spring. And then for fall, you can plant it again about July 25th through August 5th. There is one problem, or a major problem, that will happen with broccoli. And in fact, it happens to all members of the broccoli and cabbage family. So think of broccoli, cabbage, collards, kale, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, all those different vegetables. They all have problems with what's called the cabbage worm. And I talk about that a lot in my insect class. But it's a white butterfly, it lays eggs. The cabbage butterflies, the eggs hatch into little tiny green worms, little caterpillars that eat big holes in your broccoli leaves, also in your broccoli head. So there's some organic controls that make it easy to control. BT and spinosyn work very well. The other thing they warn you about with broccoli is if the temperatures are really cold at the very beginning and you have several days in a row of temperatures at freezing or just below freezing, it won't kill the plant. It may not even seem to harm the plant. But what it does is it changes the way that plant grows so it does not produce a nice big head of broccoli. You just get a little tiny broccoli that's about the size of a quarter, which is not very good. So they call that buttoning, meaning it makes a little button flower head about the size of a large button. And so if the weather's looking really, really cold, lots of temperatures in the low 30s, wait just a little bit till it warms up and plant your broccoli plants. So the other thing is broccoli plants, if you're trying to do a lot of freezing, you could plant a whole bunch in the late summer for fall and then harvest all that broccoli and freeze it because it's an excellent candidate for freezing. All right, Brussels sprouts. Many people are not big fans of Brussels sprouts, but they're actually very good. They're becoming much more popular. You can even buy them in the store now where they're still attached to the stalk, like they are growing on the stalk here. They're a little tricky to grow because they have such a long growing season. You actually plant them in the spring, like March 15th to April 15th, but then you're not going to harvest them until October. So that's a long time to be in the garden. So you have to decide, is it worth it? Because it takes up all the space in your garden for a long period of time. And also there's just lots of insects that can attack it, over that long period because it's susceptible to those cabbage loopers, the cabbage butterflies, lay the eggs, all those cabbage loopers, cabbage worms will, eat your leaves and eat your Brussels sprouts. So sometimes it's easier just to go and buy Brussels sprouts at the store, but I don't want to discourage you. The plants will get tall and you want to fertilize them because you're trying to grow a tall, big plant that will have lots of room. And as they grow up, you're going to be removing some of those lower leaves late in the season to make room for those sprouts to grow. The really highest quality Brussels sprouts will be ready for picking in the fall after we've had some light frost. So think of like mid-October. And then the quality is much better. They're much sweeter. So they'll be much better to eat. Again, you're going to be controlling insects over that long period, all the way from spring, summer, and fall. And then in the fall, in September, they actually recommend pinching out the tip of it so the growth will go into that sprouts, those sprouts that are forming along the stem. At first, they're kind of small, like just the size of a marble, and then they'll go larger. We are not in the best Brussels sprout growing area here, but I have seen some people grow some very, very high quality Brussels sprouts. All right, cabbage. Cabbage is a wonderful vegetable that I did not fully appreciate as a child, but I've since learned to like it, and there's many different ways to use it. Stir fry, roasting is a wonderful way to cook cabbage. Definitely better to plant cabbage from a transplant. If you wait for planting seeds, they won't have time to make a large head, because once it gets warm in summer, the growth in cabbage plants just slows down and they're not doing much. And the quality is not very good. The cabbage doesn't taste as good. Because we don't have a long cabbage season like you would if you were in Maine, the green cabbage definitely grows better here than red cabbage. Although we have a very good variety of red cabbage here called Red Express, but it does not make as big a heads as some of the other ones. And it definitely needs some fertilizer to help it go along. In fact, all cabbage, broccoli, all these plants benefit greatly from some nitrogen fertilizer, like you would get from using our chicken manure fertilizer. One mistake that people make is thinking that they have to wait till all the cabbage's heads are big to harvest. If you're planting out a whole bunch, like 12 or 18 plants, I recommend not letting them all go till the same time, because otherwise you're going to have 18 cabbages that you need to eat over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. And where are you going to keep them? So you can start harvesting them when that head is only about 4 inches in diameter, especially because you might be hungry for some nice, fresh, clean stuff from your garden. And then you can let the other heads develop, go a little bit longer and get larger. So again, you're going to need to be controlling those cabbage worms. The other mistake people make sometimes is they leave the cabbage in the garden too long. And especially if we have some big rains and it soaks up a whole lot of water at once, sometimes that head will just split open and rot if you leave it sitting there. If your cabbage does split open, you can still eat it, but you need to eat it fairly soon after that happens. Bring it in, wash it well. There's the planting times, pretty much the same planting times as broccoli, and that's for cabbage. There is different kinds of cabbage. This is what they call a Savoy leaf cabbage. It has kind of a wrinkly leaf, a little bit different, and some people think that helps it fight off the insects a little better. But another kind of cabbage that is becoming more popular is what sometimes called in the store called Napa cabbage. And that's because a lot of it was originally grown in the Napa Valley in California. Sometimes it's called Chinese cabbage because it definitely is of Asian origin. It is the traditional cabbage. Like if you have a stir fry recipe that's traditional, they would use this kind of cabbage, not the other kind of regular green cabbage that we just saw. Not that you can't use both. And in many, many dishes, this is the cabbage of choice for Asian recipes. So definitely want to plant from a transplant. This cabbage is surprisingly easy to grow, and it makes a really big head. And in fact, if you've ever priced one of these heads in the store, they are very expensive because it might weigh about 4 pounds and it might be $1.50 a pound. So it might end up being a $6 cabbage that you would go buy at the store, but you can grow it easily in your backyard. So very fun. It does not have as much problems with as the cabbage worms because the leaves are a little bit different, but it does have some problems with the flea beetles. But still pretty easy to grow. You can plant them in March and early April for spring garden, or you can plant them in late July and early August for a fall garden. So definitely recommend trying it. Carrots are a very popular vegetable. It was one of the first vegetables that I learned to like. It was raw carrots. For kids, they love to eat carrots, and especially they like those little baby carrots. One of the challenges with carrots is that germination can be difficult. If you don't keep the seeds evenly moist, the seeds will not germinate well. And the other thing is if your soil has lots of clay or just doesn't break up very fine, the soil gets crusty, and the little carrot seeds have a hard time breaking through that crust. The seeds are also fairly tiny, so some people just have difficulty planting tiny seeds. But We will have some resources available, some videos that will show you how to do that. And there's some ways to do it to make it easier. But once you do plant them and they start coming up, you'll need to thin them, because if you plant it out a whole bunch and they all come up, the carrots will get too crowded and they won't make a good sized carrot head. They'll just get green leafy tops with no big root. So you want to thin them out to about 1 inch apart, maybe 1.5 inches apart, and that will get you nice sized carrots. The other fun thing about carrots that is not true for most other vegetables is if you plant a fall crop, using that like August 1st date, or actually July 20th through August 5th is the ideal planting date, you can actually have nice carrots be ready in the fall, but then you can actually overwinter these carrots outside in the ground. And this is like an old farmer pioneer type trick. They used to do that because they didn't really have good sources of refrigeration, and they could not just go to the store and buy carrots, you know. So in the winter, they would keep the carrots in the ground and put heavy layer of straw over them. Sometimes you might have problems with little mice trying to come in and nibble on them. So you might put a screen around them, different things like that. But you can actually do that, and with this thick layer of mulch, the ground won't freeze. And you can actually go out and pick carrots in the middle of winter and have fresh, wonderful tasting carrots in even January and February. So that's definitely an experiment that's worth trying. All right, cauliflower. Cauliflower is in the cabbage and broccoli family, and it's actually very similar to broccoli. Again, what you're eating is a flower head that hasn't opened up. It's easier to do, of course, from transplants. And I tell people, try to buy transplants that aren't too old. Sometimes at a nursery, if it's the little seeds have been in, the little plants have been in their containers for like more than 6 weeks, they will get kind of root bound. The roots will get all twisted and tied up together, and they don't transplant very well. And it doesn't make a very good plant. And this is true for many plants, but it seems especially true for cauliflower if the roots are real root bound. So you're going to plant this. It's a little more difficult than broccoli, and it's got some special nuances. And one of those is that you actually need to cover up this head as it's growing. Right now you can see it's not covered up, but as this head is starting to produce, you'll see it when it's about the size of a button. It's starting out, little white head, and you want to take the leaves of the cauliflower plant and pull them up and fasten them like with a clothespin or rubber band so that they completely cover this head so you can't see it. And that head is going to form inside. And what that is going to do is protect it from the sun, because if you let it be exposed to the sun, it's going to change the color and the quality. So this is called blanching the cauliflower. And again, you can do that with a clothespin or rubber band, and just bring those wrapper leaves, they call them, that's the upper leaf, up and fold them over and just kind of wrap that thing up, and it will protect it from the sun. So otherwise you'll get either yellow heads or sometimes they go purple and the quality is not very good. And then you also want to pick it while the little curds, the little buds are still tight. You don't want them to start opening up and start flowering. So it can be kind of a challenge to grow. Again, some years cauliflower just doesn't do very well, and it's usually based on weather conditions. Other years you'll be going along and you don't know why, but it just is a great year for cauliflower. It seems like even late summer, the planting time in July and early August is better than the spring planting time. So if you like cauliflower, it's definitely worth trying. But if you have difficulty, I would say try broccoli first because it's easier to grow. Cilantro is an easy vegetable to grow. It's a green, very popular these days. Typically people either really love cilantro or they just can't stand it. So if you love it or you want to try it, it's pretty easy to do. It's better to seed it directly rather than trying to buy plants. Some of the nurseries will sell plants, but usually they will go to seed pretty quickly. And with cilantro, you are trying to get the leaves to produce, not having it go to seed. Although it's interesting, the seeds that you actually do get from your cilantro are actually what is used in the herb coriander. If you've ever seen coriander herbs in the grocery store, powdered or whatever, that or whole coriander seed, that's what comes from the cilantro plant. The varieties that we use are special varieties, though, that go to seed slowly. They're called slow bolting. So you definitely want to plant a variety from that. If you just order coriander seed, it will go to seed very quickly and will be frustrating for you to try and harvest the leaves. And of course, the hotter it gets and the more advanced summer comes, then you have it bolting very quickly. So what I recommend to people is doing several plantings, like starting in March, middle of March, plant cilantro and plant it every 2 weeks. And you can actually get it to go into the summer, unlike lettuce, which would be terrible in summer. If you can get cilantro and keep it going, it will still produce and still taste okay, but it does go to seed very quickly. So if you keep planting it and keep planting it, then you'll still always have something going. Then of course, plant it again in late summer for fall, it will do much better. So, and the fall crops will just go on and last much longer because it's not getting hot in the fall as the season progresses. Collards. Collard greens are wonderful. They're very tasty, very nutritious. Botanists think that really collard was kind of the original cabbage plants, or cabbage were developed from collards. And eventually they developed, collards that made these heads that wrapped up tightly. And so anyhow, but very nutritious. You can grow plants from either seeds or plants. Some people like to use the plants to get a head start on the season, but you can plant and get nice collards just from planting seeds. It just takes a little bit longer. Collards grow best in the cool season, but they will grow all summer, unlike, cabbage or broccoli will not grow well during the summer, but collards will keep on growing. Their best flavor, though, will be, again, in the fall, although you can eat them throughout the season. But in the fall, once it's been cool and has some light frost, the plants have more sugars in them and they taste better. So, like I say, you can make the plant go all seasons, spring, summer, and fall, although some people like to start out with new plants for the fall and grow some more for that. They are very cold hardy, can take a lot of cold. It's one of the cold hardiest vegetables we have. Sometimes it will even go over the winter, although usually when it does go over the winter, it will go to seed fairly quickly. But usually people are picking them. You can see here some collard plants that are mature and the lower leaves have all been picked up. So they just keep picking them as they grow and grow and grow. And they've got some nice looking leaves at the top that are ready to pick, and then it will just continue to grow. Sometimes these will get 5 feet tall, so it'll be very good size. It's not unusual for collard plants, greens, to be harvesting even up until Thanksgiving, especially if you row cover them. And even in a very cold year, if you have them row covered, you might be picking some in January and February. So it's very, very hardy green, which is handy for that time of year. Planting times March 15th to April 10th, although you can plant them later. And then again, July 25th through August 5th for fall gardens. Kale is similar to collards in many ways. Kale's been very popular lately. There's lots of recipes for kale. Kale salads, all kinds of amazing kale salads out there. Stir fries. The kale typically has these crinkly leaves like this. In fact, lots of times they'll use it as a decoration on a plate when you go to a restaurant, they'll use a little kale leaf. But there's other kinds of kale too. There's some different colors, some purple and red versions of it. There's also what they call a dinosaur kale, or there's another name which I can't remember right now. But anyhow, so there's different varieties, and some people prefer some varieties over the other. But this is a typical kale plant here. And kale is very hardy and can overwinter nicely, especially if you row cover it. Again, we planted some young kale plants late last September, which is a little bit late past the normal planting time. And we had wonderful little kale that you could pick in December, January, or February. It just kind of stays out there under the row cover. And even now you could go out and pick them because it'll still be a while. If you plant kale now, it's going to be a while before you can harvest them. So I strongly recommend trying that with collards and kale and spinach, overwintering young plants for harvesting over the winter. You can pick the leaves all through spring and summer. You can freeze collard greens that have been processed. So very, very useful plant. These are the planting dates again, but you can also plant later for they don't do as well, they won't grow as fast, but if you're planting a little bit past April 10th, you can still get some plants going. All right, lettuce. There's different kinds of lettuces, many different colors of lettuce, greens, reds, different shades. Some varieties do better as seeds, some better as plants if it's a head lettuce. And a lot of people think we can't grow good head lettuce here, and we most certainly can. But there's so many better varieties of lettuce, head lettuce, than like the iceberg head lettuce that you often see in the store. So seeds or transplants, you can do either one. Succession planting is helpful, meaning plant some now and then plant some 2 weeks later, then plant some more 2 weeks later until the season ends. Lettuce does not do well once it gets hot. The heat and the longer days will stimulate that into bolting and will mean that we'll start to go to seed. The plant picture on the top there is a nice head lettuce. That's one of my favorites. That's called canasta. It makes a wonderful crisp lettuce, very high quality. Below it, you can see what happens is when the lettuce starts to go to seed, it starts to do that thing where it kind of stretches out like a little tower, and the little seed heads and flower buds form up there near the top. So that's lettuce that is no longer good to eat. If it starts to bolt, just pull it out and get rid of it. It will, if you break off a leaf, you'll see white sap, and that's definitely a sign that it's starting to go bad. So that succession planting is helpful though, just because that means all of your lettuce won't be maturing at the same time. There's a couple different ways you can grow lettuce. One is if you're planting seeds, like for instance, we have a mixture, we call it our KCCG special anniversary seed. And it was a mixture we developed several years ago. It has many different kinds. And when you plant that, you get similar, or what I consider better than what you would get if you go to the store and buy like spring mix, where you have all the different kinds of lettuces mixed together. And those leaves you would harvest individually, and they'd be planted closely together and trim them with the scissors, and then they'll grow back, and you might be able to trim them again and do that 2 or 3 times before they start going to seed. But the other kind would be where you'd plant a lettuce plant, and that's the top there. That's like the canasta, or we also have Coastal Star, which is romaine lettuce. We have a couple other head lettuces. And those will develop into a full-size head and make a very, very nice head. Again, you don't have to harvest them all at the same time. You can pick some of them when they're small heads so that you don't have to eat all the lettuce at the same time. Mustard and turnips. And we are getting close to the end here, in case you're wondering how long this will last. Mustard and turnips are typically grown for the greens. Some people like to mix them together. One of the biggest mistakes people make is putting their seeds too closely together and then not thinning them. So sprinkle out your seeds. When they come up, thin them so they spread apart at least 2 to 3 inches apart. And that will give it time or room for the plants to grow and develop nice sized leaves. The other thing is as you cut the leaves, that will stimulate new growth. And so you're cutting them and it will produce more leaves for eating later. Once it starts getting hot, warm weather comes, they will go to seed quickly, especially the mustard weeds. They seem to go extra fast. Flea beetles can also be a problem for these. that can be controlled with some good standard organic insect control methods. So onions, and onions are one of my favorite vegetables. And there's different ways to plant onions. Typically, you would not plant onion seeds. You would be planting either onion plants, like we sell here at the community gardens, or you'd be planting onion sets. An onion set refers to actually like a little tiny onion bulb. You'll see these in the nurseries and garden centers, and here at community gardens, you'll buy a little bag of little tiny onion bulbs that are about the size of a marble. And those are great for growing green onions here. Because we don't have ideal growing conditions, they typically do not make really big bulb onions, although you can use them for growing bulb onions. And if you give them lots of fertilizer and lots of water and you get them in early, you can get some pretty good sized onions. But it's much easier to grow large bulb onions by growing plants. And we have 3 really good varieties that are especially well suited to our area here. And so I recommend, if you're trying to get bulb onions, actually buying the plants. And if you're a beginning onion gardener, I would recommend strongly the white variety of onion we have called Superstar. Very easy to grow and get big onions. So the onion sets that we have, you can plant them continually. They'll grow throughout the season, and they just get to the size of harvesting for a green onion or a scallion, they're called sometimes. And you're not letting them try to develop a bulb, but just picking them and eating the leaves. So you can put those really, really close together, like an inch apart. Whereas like for planting onion bulbs, you're gonna set the plants about 4 to 6 inches apart because those onion bulbs are hopefully gonna get big. And you can plant them together closely like that. Even though it looks like it's gonna be too close, they'll be fine. If you're trying to get the big bulbs there on the top. So when you do pick those big bulbs, you're gonna wanna let them dry, but typically you're not gonna dry them in the full sun because sometimes the bulbs will actually sunburn if it's getting really hot. So you do wanna get your onions in really, really early. So either the plants or the sets, either way, try to get them in early so they can get a good early start on the season. Planting date for onions is March 15th to April 15th. But if you're trying to get good big bulb onions, I definitely recommend trying to get them in early March, or not early March, but mid-March to the end of March. All right, peas. Peas must be planted very early. They only produce for a short time because once it gets hot, peas are done. And they don't typically do well as a fall crop. There are different kinds of peas. English peas, which are basically, you know, when you buy frozen peas at the store, you're eating the little green round peas. Those are English peas. Snow peas are the pods that we often eat in Asian cooking. They're flat and good for stir fries. And then there's snap peas, particularly the variety sugar snap pea, which is kind of a multi-purpose pea. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Very important to trellis because pea vines like to climb. You need to get a trellis in, a good sturdy trellis. I recommend using cattle panel. If you need to see what those look like, you can come visit us at the community gardens. We can show you what they look like. They make a really easy, strong trellis for your peas. The other thing is you need to pick them regularly. If you let the peas stay on the vines too long, the pea production will slow down and they'll just be producing those peas that are already there. But if you keep picking them, it will keep flowering at least until it gets really hot, and it'll keep those peas coming along until it gets too hot. I also recommend mulching them to keep the soil cool, especially once it starts getting warmer. That'll just help the peas to go longer in the season. Just because when it gets hot, the blossoms will not form anymore and your peas will be done. Some people have had limited success in trying to grow peas for fall if you're growing a short vine variety like Sugar Ann or Sugar Bond because they don't get as tall, they have enough time to grow in the fall. So it's definitely worth trying to grow some of that. Again, here's these three kinds of peas. You can see at the top English peas. And so these, you would just eat the seeds inside. You're not going to eat the pod. The pod is kind of fibrous, stringy, not very good. Snow peas, the edible portion is the pod. And you want to pick these early before those peas get big and round and fat, because once they get big and round and fat, they're not high quality peas. So you can see the little seeds in the metal. Those are little tiny seeds just starting to form, and that's the good stage. You'll see they'll be just little bumps, but overall these will be flat. So snow peas are great. They can be frozen, just like English peas can be frozen. And then there's sugar snap peas, which basically you can eat the pods and the seeds. So you can eat them at different stages. When these first start growing, you're going to see them, they will have flat pods like this, and you can harvest them as a snow pea when they're flat and use them in stir fries. At that point, they're not very sweet. Or you can let them go a little bit longer, and those peas will start to form inside, and the pods will get kind of fat and a little thicker like that. And at that point, they're very sweet and crunchy, and they make a great snack. You can get kids to eat sugar snap peas who would not normally touch a regular pea. But if you wait too long and leave them on the vine too long, they'll actually turn into full-grown peas. And inside, then you can harvest out the pea seeds and eat them like that. Because once they're overly mature, the pods are not that great, but you can eat the peas on the inside. But typically, you would pick them at this stage and then just be able to steam them or saute them or cook them however you want. They're very good. They're also kind of expensive to grow your own sugar snap peas. So it's definitely, it's definitely worthwhile to grow your own, because buying them in the store, they're pretty expensive. So here's the good reasons for growing those sugar snap peas. They're versatile. Like I said, you can harvest them at different stages. Very popular with children. You can just snack on them straight from the garden. Very nutritious. As I mentioned, they are expensive to buy in the store. They're also legume. All the peas and beans are members of the legume family, and they actually are able to take nitrogen out of the air and add it into the soil. So that's kind of a good thing. And you can freeze them, so you can eat them year round, and they're just great tasting. If you haven't had a fresh sugar snap pea, I strongly recommend that you try them. All right, potatoes. When you're eating a potato, what you're eating is the tuber, which botanically is classified as a swollen stem. So it's like a stem that becomes very swollen so that it can store food for the plant. And then it has different buds on it. And that's what these eyes are. They're actually buds where stems will sprout out. And so when you're going to plant these, you buy them as seed potatoes, like we sell here at our garden center. And if it's a larger one like this, you might cut it in half or thirds or even fourths. If it's a tinier one, like the size of an egg or smaller, you can plant the whole potato. But each one of the pieces that you're going to plant should have 2 or 3 eyes on it, hopefully. That will give it some nice sprouts, so it will have enough stems in order to produce some new potatoes coming along. The other thing they recommend is hilling up those potatoes, because you're going to plant these about 3 inches deep, but the potatoes are actually going to form above that piece that you planted, not below it. So you plant them about 3 inches deep. It's only got 3 inches of soil. So as the vine grows, you're going to hill up the soil around it so that then it will have about 6 inches of soil. And then at some point you might hill it the second time. So it'll have about 8 inches of soil. And that will give you a nice big area above that piece that you planted for the potatoes to form. And you'll get more potatoes if you do that hilling up. You can also pick potatoes early as opposed to letting them get big. And I will tell you right now, the little tiny round red potatoes that you can grow in your garden are going to be so tasty. It's almost hard to let some of them go on till bigger. So some people will plant some for harvesting fresh, small, new potatoes. Other people will, and also then have some growing for harvesting larger potatoes to keep for a longer season. So definitely want to plant early. That planting window is March 20th to April 10th, but earlier is better because you'll have a longer season for producing those tuberose. All right, radishes, very small little roots. One of the fastest crops. It only takes about 21 days to 28 days to get a full-size radish. And radishes are typically, oh gosh, they're about an inch in diameter, inch and a half maybe. The seeds germinate fast. They're easy to germinate. You can start eating them when they're small, even about the size of a marble. But more typically, you'd eat them like when they're about an inch to an inch and a half in diameter. If you let them go too long, they will get large, they will get tough, they will get woody, and they'll be super, super hot and spicy, and not in a good way. So you want to pick them while they're small and young. And again, you'll see that planting dates. And it's definitely important to plant them early in that window. If you wait too long, they produce leaves, but they don't produce a radish root, which is kind of the point. And in fall, you know, you got to get inside that window too if you want to get nice roots to form. So spinach, I think we got just a couple more here. Spinach is a wonderful vegetable. Of course, you know, lots of different ways to cook it. It does need that cool soil, so it's hard to plant in the late summer for fall sometimes. But biggest mistake I see people make is either planting too late, but also not thinning their plants. You want the spinach plants to be a couple inches apart. If they're too close, the leaves don't get very big, and you won't get nice sized spinach leaves. When it gets hot, spinach will go to seed fairly quickly, like lettuce. It doesn't get super bitter, but it just stops producing new leaves and does not do well. So definitely want to plant it early. And spinach is a little unique. It's very hardy. It's actually considered a hardy winter annual. So it can go over the winter as a live plant, and you can actually pick it over the winter. If it has been row covered, the leaves will stay in good shape. So there's kind of 3 planting times in spring. You could put it out, it says March 20th, but you could even put it out sooner. It won't do anything bad. If you do it sooner, it just may take a while to sprout. All the way up to about April 20th, and after that, it gets too late because it goes to seed too quickly. And then there's a second planting season for fall harvest. That would be about August 1st to August 20th. But then third time would be to plant some about September 1st through the end of September. And that would be spinach that you could overwinter. And overwintering would allow you to have some row cover over it and then go out and harvest spinach in December and January and February, and even early March and April. And our last vegetable is Swiss chard. Swiss chard is related to beets, essentially the same plant origin as beet, but it was developed more for leaves. So it's kind of a beet plant without the bottom. It has very large leaves. It's a great substitute for spinach. It is great because it grows all summer long. Unlike, you know, spinach or mustard or collard greens, they all give up or don't do as well once it gets hot. But Swiss chard will grow in the spring, the summer, and the fall. It's also super nutritious, and it's very colorful, ornamental. There's some varieties out that have lots of color in the stems. This is our favorite variety that we sell here. It's called Bright Lights because it has like orange and red and pink and green and light yellow, all in the same package. So it's very fun to grow these vegetables. So planting time, April 1st through about May 30th. But then also again for fall, about August 1st to August 10th is ideal. So lots of room on the planting calendar for Swiss chard. And I think that is it. Yep, so I wish you good luck with your spring planting. Watch the weather, see what happens here. Next week, we'll be having our plant sale. We'll have broccoli, cabbage plants, all that stuff on sale. Check out our website for information on that. And then once it gets to actual planting time, try to get your garden ready and tilled. It's been raining a lot lately, so if you get a nice dry period, get your garden forked up or tilled and get it ready, at least some of it, so you can plant the early spring stuff. and then watch that 10-day forecast. And hopefully we'll have a wonderful spring season, and I hope to get to see you all soon in the garden. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Hey, Ben, I just emailed you a list of questions, so check your email, and
okay.
about 7 or 8 questions there for you.
Okay. Let me see if I can bring that up right now. If I can get to my email. All right. So how do you tent the row cover over your plants? Some people will make a little structure using PVC pipe or wire. I've even had people use a little structure like, well, they'll take a tomato cage and open it up and put that on its side and just spread the row cover over it. But the other thing to know is you can actually put the row cover over the plants without any structure there whatsoever. It is so lightweight. You can put it on it, and if you allow enough room for it to grow, it will lift, as the plants grow, it will lift up the row cover. So you don't necessarily have to have a structure unless you want to make something out of PVC pipe or, again, the wire or tomato cage. Or some people will just make like a wooden box type frame and just staple it to that, like a little cold frame. So there's different ways to put that row cover over that. Okay. So why not till the mulch in when tilling? That's a good point. Yes, you can absolutely do that. The problem is sometimes the soil is already too wet and you may not be able to till right away. So I tell people pull that mulch back so the ground can dry. I actually recommend tilling that mulch in the fall. Some people like to leave the mulch on over the winter. You can do it either way. In the fall, it's probably a little easier to get it tilled in. In the springtime, if we're getting lots of rain, it's just difficult to find a nice dry period. But if you pull it back and let the ground dry out, then you could actually spread it out over the garden again and then till it in right before you do it. Because, yeah, tilling the mulch in is a great way to add organic matter to your soil. Okay, so question about the arugula that had the flea beetles in that picture. Yes, I would cut those leaves off and discard them. You can just consume them. It just depends on how much the holes, it's not going to be a danger, a health danger. So if you have just a few little holes, I would say, sure, I would eat those. If you have lots of holes, it might just look less tasty, but you can still eat them. It will be all right. But the ideal thing would be to try and control them, you know, before they get too many holes. So you do not need to plant 2 or more broccoli plants for success. You can plant just one. They don't pollinate each other, so there's no pollination requirement there. But usually it's more fun to plant at least a 3-pack or a 6-pack, just because it's nice to have lots and lots of broccoli. But if you haven't grown it before, yeah, sure, you could just try one and try it. So we do have a couple of different kinds of broccoli. We have one that's kind of an early broccoli and another one that's a later broccoli and one that's a medium one. So if you plant the different kinds, they'll be producing at different times and it'll just give you some variety. If you see your arugula or spinach starting to produce a flower, is the life of that plant over? Or can we cut them off and still harvest? Typically, cutting them off does not extend the useful life of more green growth. And with lettuce, it'll already have gone bitter by that point. So, I mean, you could try to keep it for a little while longer, but they usually typically don't start producing more leaves once they go to seed, or once you even see that stalk just starting to form. So I would just harvest what's left. If it's not too bitter lettuce, then yeah, harvest it. Otherwise, I would pull them out pretty quick and plant something else in their place. All right, so if lettuce beets bolt, is there a best way to harvest the seeds for saving them? If you're trying to save your own seeds, yes, you could totally do that. The problem will be is you're going to need that plant to stay in place for a long time. typically you'd be pulling that plant out and then planting something else in its place. If you're going to let it go to seed, like a lettuce plant, you're going to need to let it stay there and let those seeds, first they'll flower first, and then the seeds will start to form, and they'll be green, and then they'll actually need to grow brown and dry and fully dry on the plant. And then once they do that, then you can cut them off and save them. Like some people put them in a brown paper bag and save the seeds for later. There's some really good books on seed saving. I will tell you, it's a lot of work, especially for the small, tiny seeds like that. But if you're interested in seed saving, it's kind of fun and interesting. And it also is a great way to teach kids about the complete life cycle of a plant. So, all right, is there any reason why we don't typically eat the leaves from the broccoli plant? Actually, no. You can eat the leaves from the broccoli plant. Some people think they aren't quite as good as like a cabbage plant or collard greens, but I know some people who do eat their broccoli leaves. You don't want to start picking those leaves though early because you want the broccoli head to form. If you do it too early, it'll stop the broccoli head from forming. But once the head is formed, you can go ahead and eat those leaves. I would probably recommend eating the younger, more tender leaves, and just use them like you might use cabbage, saute in a stir fry or something like that. That is the interesting part about broccoli. There's other parts of it which are edible. I know some people talk about the actual stalk of the broccoli, because it gets kind of tough. But the younger part of it is, even though it's fairly hard, some people will actually like put it in a juicer and blend it and then add it to a soup. So it even has some purpose. So broccoli is kind of a multi-purpose plant. All right, edamame. This is obviously not an early spring crop. Edamame is the beans from the soybean plant that you're eating at a young, tender green stage. And yes, you can grow them in a container, was the question. It's just that you would not get a lot of production, so you wouldn't get very much, but you could grow a few. If you had a really large container, like a 50-gallon drum cut in half, or like a storage tote, you could do that. So if you really, really, really want to try to grow some edamame and you don't have the garden, you could try to grow some in a container. You just would not get a lot of production. All right, so asking a question about potatoes, do you need to let the eyes sprout before planting? You don't. It is helpful because that helps you when you're cutting it up, because you can see where the sprouts are. So you're making sure that each piece that you cut has some eyes on it easier. And the more advanced the sprouts are, the quicker the plant will start growing. So it just kind of gives it a head start. Some people will actually try to get their seed potatoes, if you get them early or you're saving your own seed potatoes, and they'll take those potatoes and put them in a brown paper bag, maybe with a little bit of potting soil in there and just a little bit of moisture. That will start those sprouts coming out quicker. Normally you don't want your potatoes to sprout when you're going to eat them. But for planting, yes, if you can get those sprouts to sprout out a little bit quicker, that will help them, but it's not required. So don't have to do that. Okay, do you need an actual trellis for the peas, or would a pole work? You could use a pole, but you would actually need a pole for each plant, or each couple of plants. So if you had lots of little tiny poles, like people used to use bamboo, they would do that, and then sometimes they'll tie them together with a cross piece across the top. You could use that. And so they will climb right up those little tiny poles if they're not too thick. So that would work with that. So those are our questions. Great questions. Appreciate that. If you have more questions, as Rob mentioned, you can send us an email just at contact@kccg.org.
Hey, Ben, I'm sorry to interrupt. I got two more if you can answer them.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's see. Can I plant seeds and plants this weekend, or is the ground too muddy after the recent rains? This person has in-ground plots.
Yes. I'm guessing, unless your ground has already maybe been tilled, It's probably going to be too muddy. Although by Sunday, it's going to be sunny today, tomorrow, and Sunday. It's going to be pretty sunny. So if your ground has already been tilled, or you could fork it up now. If you fork it up now and you're not tilling it and just kind of flip it over, that will help it dry out, and then take a rake and kind of smooth it over. I'm thinking you could plant some stuff by Sunday, which would actually be good, because then they're talking about rain again on Monday and Tuesday. And that's where it gets really tricky here in the spring, is finding just that little opportunity in between the rains. And sometimes you have to do something like that, where you take your fork and kind of open up the ground, and then, rake it out and just plant at least your little seeds. So it definitely is worth trying to do that. But again, that's where raised beds really do come in handy. As far as temperatures go, we're looking really good for the next 10 days. We're not even going to be in the low 30s. So mid 30s and up, and 40s at night. So next week will be good for planting plants. Another question?
And the last one is off the top of your head, from all the varieties that you covered today, which ones would be good for container gardening?
Sure. Lettuce is a really good one. I would recommend lettuce because it's easy to do, but also broccoli is pretty easy to do. Actually, the sugar snap peas are pretty easy to do in a container. And I think we might even actually have a special guide sheet for planting in containers, like how far apart and how close, how many plants can you put in a container. I don't think that's on the website yet, but if you email us, we might be able to find that for you. But yeah, so that would be another good choice. Collards would be another one. Arugula is pretty good, and kale. Those are all pretty good choices, and Swiss chard would all be good choices for growing in containers. And if that's it, great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you checking out the community gardens. And again, hope to see you soon.
Everybody have a good weekend. Thanks.